Adam had fallen, Augustine wrote, in the city of God, not because the serpent had deceived him. He chose to sin, and in doing so he lost paradise, because the man could not bear to be severed from his only companion. Augustine had, as best he could within the limits of his fallen condition, undone Adam's choice. He had tried, with the help of his sainted mother, to move away from ardor, to flee from arousal. He had converted. True, he still had those involuntary dreams, those unwelcome stirrings, but what he knew about Adam and Eve in their state of innocence reassured him that someday, with Jesus' help, he would have total control over his own body. That would be the perfect and the final conversion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stephen Greenblatt, for this completely secular talk about religious conversion. Wir haben vor, Gespräch zu beginnen hier auf diesem Podium und haben uns vorher verständigt, dass wir keine gemeinsamen Arbeitsgebiete haben, dass wir beide keine Spezialisten über Augustinus sind und es trotzdem versuchen wollen. Es wird auf jeden Fall die Möglichkeit geben, aus dem Publikum Fragen zu stellen, spätestens wenn wir auf dem Podium vorne kapitulieren, was früher oder später sicher geschehen wird. But let me just begin. I think one of the most important aspects of your talk is not only erection, not only the involuntary movement, and not only the role of women within this very interesting context of North African men, but I think it's a sort of narrative form which is intimately linked to the confessions of Augustinus, and I would ask you if you would consent to this thesis or hypothesis. I have the impression that the role of conversion, so the literary role of conversion, not the religious role of conversion, is in a certain way the transformation of contingency into necessity, and that could be a very important, could have a very important future for autobiographical writing itself. What would you think about it?
Yeah, several things. Fascinating on several accounts. Yes, the simplest thing to say, at least within my little exemplary narrative, is that something that seems entirely accidental, random, and, as you say, contingent, a boy goes to the bathhouse with his father and something happens, turns out to be eventually braided into something that, to the person himself, Augustine, seems necessary, but actually is locked into a 1600-year account that follows this, to an extraordinarily long fixed history. Well, fixed in the sense of unfolding from what appears to be a purely random event. Of course, nothing is entirely random, just as nothing is entirely fixed, but it was important to capture what seemed like a purely contingent event, a purely accidental event. And the idea of the accidental event connects to the very first thing that you said, or contingent event, rather more than accidental. Why a narrative? Why Augustine's narrative in the Confessions? Why the narrative in the beginning of the book of Genesis? Or why, for that matter, my imposing on you, instead of doing what I know I should have done, particularly in a German setting, to give you an argument, did I give you a story instead? And it's because the presence of the narrative is crucial to capture something essential in what appears to be an argument or doctrine. And it was crucial all through Augustine's life. And there's much we can say, but I won't go on, about why, in any case, as I said at the very beginning of my talk, the point of focus ultimately for the work I'm doing, why a story in the first place? Why does this story have this peculiar compelling force over a very long period of time? Just one other thing to say, which is that the story in the garden, the Adam and Eve story, crucially depends for its doctrinal meaning as well as in its narrative form on what appears to be something contingent. If it was necessary, the story would have no ethical meaning at all.
And there's probably another question which could be interesting, especially for you or for our view on you and your research. Normally, we talk about conversion as a transformation from disbelief to belief, from secularity to Christianity or whatever. And in my experience of your writings, I got the impression that you yourself argue always completely secular, with a sort of plaidoyer for secular writing. Do you know any incidences for the change in the other way around, from belief to disbelief? Is there a conversion of this sort?
Yes, there certainly is. Otherwise, the world would look rather different from the way it looks now. If there hadn't been a quite massive succession of conversion experiences from belief to skepticism or disbelief. I should say for myself that, first of all, I should acknowledge that in some sense you're utterly correct, and in some sense you're not about just autobiographically, though won't be particularly interesting, but I should put on the table that I do it in the spirit of Lucretius, says, or Epicurus was said to have said that it's okay to go to the temple of Venus to pray. You just mustn't believe that Venus is going to do anything for you. There's a certain number of observances in my own life that I inherited from my upbringing and childhood that I continue to follow, but without any belief attached to them. But I once did believe. I grew up in a very observant Jewish household, and I did have a conversion experience out, and maybe relevant to this, which was that my parents told me there is a moment at the end of the Jewish service in which there's a priestly benediction, it's called, and this can't be doctrinal, but in any case, I was told by my parents, probably to keep me occupied when I was a child, that you had to bow your head during the priestly benediction because God was passing through the synagogue, and if you saw God face to face, you would die, as we know from the Bible. So I dutifully put my head down, but at a certain point in my life, still as a very young child, I developed a tremendous desire to see God face to face. And so I struggled actually for weeks with the thought. I knew if I said to my parents that I was going to lift my head up, they would tell me not because they loved me and didn't want me to die, but I kept to myself this thought, and then I, actually thinking it through and willing to accept the consequences, I forced myself finally to lift up my head during the priestly benediction. And I looked around and I saw, of course, that I was probably the only one in the synagogue who had his head down, that everyone was saying, I'll see you afterwards, whatever. And I still remember that feeling. I've been lied to. I had that incredibly intense feeling from which I never recovered. I never got my primal faith back. So that was my initiation, my conversion experience, and it was, in that sense, once for all, which only says that I'm crude, because I understand perfectly well that kind of conversion, that why should I have thought it was just a silly story, and that I just became the village atheist for nothing. But nonetheless, one can't recover from certain things. I never was able to recover from that, no matter how sophisticated I became about, how these stories function.
Thank you so much. Last question from my side, much more complicated question, and even a sort of a theoretical question. I think from the beginning of the writings, a very important category or concept is the concept of intensity. For example, in your Shakespeare studies, intensity is linked to ghosts, intensity is linked to sexuality, intensity is linked also to some experience with politics. And this kind of intensity is also one of the important accesses to your works in new historicism. But in this talk, in your last talk, in this talk here, you also used the concept of intensity to describe conversion. Is there a certain theoretical, methodical link between your perspective on conversion and your theoretical, methodical background?
Oh, interesting. I don't have an easy response to that, though I should clearly think about it. The reason that I'm hesitating is that certainly in my work in the past, and to that matter in the present, I'm interested in, how shall we say, the kind of intensity that comes from aesthetic experiences, and I am aware, and it doesn't need a neurologist studying mirror neurons because it's already fully available to the ancients to understand that certain fictive experiences, that's already fully written out in Augustine, certain experiences of non-real events can produce incredibly intense somatic responses. I mean, this is an ancient theme, and it continues up through the Renaissance and Hamlet and so forth, and continues to the present. We know that. You can, in fact, get even sometimes far more intense experiences, somatic experiences, through fictive, entirely fictive experiences than through real life. So if the question is, what's the relationship between that kind of intensity and conversion? Conversion is, as I said in this paper, the strangely making real, and if it works once and for all, the thing that you can actually have as an entirely virtual experience. So I would have said, if you mean methodically or in principle, theoretically, that there must be no principled theoretical link between intensity and the intensity of an experience and conversion. I mean, unless you actually fully credit which I don't because I'm too secular and skeptical, that Augustine had something with his mother that only if you convert to Christianity in the garden with your mother you could possibly have. Augustine tries to reproduce, in fact, for his readers what he knows his readers haven't and will never experience. That satori, as the Japanese would call it, that thing he has with his mother. But he thinks he can actually sort of mime it in prose. And so I take that to be the principle not of conversion, but the principle of art. That art gives you recurrent access to experiences that you don't need to convert for. And so I would say art is at least as much the alternative to conversion as it is the road to it.
Thank you so much for a precise answer to a very imprecise question. I think time goes by, and we should open the question for the audience, please. If there are some questions, give me a sign. And you can ask the question in German and in English, probably also in French.
You can translate in any case for me in both of these languages or any other language that comes my way.
Here's one.
You went a long way to explain some meta-thinking about I mean, you didn't make a psychoanalysis of Lucretius, but you pointed out a lot of items concerning his writing and maybe his thinking, his context, as you did now with Augustine. But of course there are two different poles. So Lucretius is atomistic, Epicurean, Kapos, and he is not, he doesn't go into this kind of metaphysics like Augustinus does after he stopped being a Manichaean. And then the reception is also two poles. I mean, there's 3 or 4 really key manuscripts. So the Benedictine order did not have a problem with Lucretius in Fulda or Murbach, where they kept probably his writings. But, yes, Mr. Vogel, I'm stopping soon, but I have to point out what I mean. So after these copies were made, but also in St. Peter and Salzburg, on order of Charlemagne and Alcuin, things were copied. So maybe they just got a note to copy this, yes, but they didn't have a problem doing it. So after that, as you pointed out, there comes this big silence until Brescia 1473, the first printing. And then even after that, Marsilio Ficino has a problem, and Giordano Bruno is not careful, but Marsilio Ficino is careful. And of course, in the Prince, Machiavelli doesn't dare to call Lucretius writing by name. So there is always this ambiguity between the two poles, and in this foreword you were advocating one point of view, more pagan, cosmological thinking, and now you presented another pole. That's very interesting. I don't know if you, of course, this kept us busy until 1600. I don't know if it needs to be commented, but it is rather fascinating.
Thank you. Well, it is the case that in many ways you could say that Lucretius and Augustinus were antitypes, are poles apart in every way. Perhaps the one thing we could say, though certainly I don't think, unless this is my secret psychoanalytical explanation, the one thing that they share is some sense of the disturbance of sexuality. Because for Lucretius, for the De Rem Natura, sexual intensity is a problem, not because, for any of the reasons that I was describing today, but because it's close to pain. Lucretius says that it's the goal is the pursuit of pleasure. The goal of Epicureanism is the pursuit of pleasure, and the highest form of pleasure is, as Augustine says, is sexual intercourse. But the problem for Lucretius is that sexual intercourse is also at the very edge of pain, and it's a philosophical problem as well as a psychological problem, probably, for him. He has to explain how that's possible. So his proposed solution is that you take a lot of lovers and you reduce the investment, the emotional and even physical investment in any particular lover, and as many as possible, and you thin out or diminish the intensity, therefore, of the experience. Now, interestingly, there's an amazing passage in the Confessions in which Augustine says that if he hadn't believed if he hadn't converted and hadn't believed in Christianity, that what would have made most sense to him was Epicureanism, that is to say, Lucretius. So, in that sense, there's a strange sense of perhaps of what Joseph Conrad calls secret shares about them, even though they're poles apart at other ends of the moral and ethical universe.
But I think there's one very important aspect in Lucretius which is important for your work, but also for philosophers like Gilles Deleuze or Michel Serres. It's the notion of clinamen, yes, which means, in a literary sense, contingency. Yeah. And I have the impression that what is clinamen in Lucretius is, in literary terms, anecdote, something which springs out of rails.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but it's true. But Augustine must have thought, I think clearly thought, that clinamen, that the declinatio, that some contingency, every aspect of that was ultimately absorbed into a divine plan. And Epicurus and Lucretius absolutely denied such a notion. So in that sense, they wouldn't have found, even though you're right that some kind of swerve is or radical contingency important in both, they would have seen ultimately a different solution.
Are there other questions?
Thank you very much for the talk. I do have a question focusing two words or concepts you did not mention in your paper, and these are the concepts of shame and revenge. So the story you were telling about the conversion of Augustine, for me it sounded like a retelling of the revenge to the father. And I was wondering how the conversion, or how the concept of being ashamed of what had happened in the bath would be more dominant, or revenging the reaction his father had concerning this initial episode in the bath.
No, I see the extremely interesting. It's an interesting question and a significant one. Let me say that as a general principle having to do with the talk I just gave, I had a kind of theoretical as well as how should we say, rightly problem. How much do I want this to fold finally into an Oedipal narrative? How much do I want this finally to be about a family romance? I didn't want to. I wanted to structure this around this experience, and the experience. It would have been, I think, a betrayal of the experience to suppress the father, suppress the mother, talk about the theoretical problem of arousal without will. You could, after all, within the, how should we say, doctrines of the church, or thinking about those doctrines purely theoretically, drop the entire family romance and just think about the problem of the involuntary and the control, the ideal control of the body. But I thought that was a lie. I thought that at the same time, I had the problem in the other direction. Do I want to make this? Am I putting Augustine on the couch and making this a story of his relationship to his mother and father? In some sense, yes. But in some sense, the long-term story is not finally this. The long-term story is a bit of the, how should we say, contingency that happens to lead to this enormous change in the self-conception of the West and its account of its origins, of what its primordial origins are. So I tried to have it both ways, and I withheld an account of either revenge on the father. I did actually refer to shame in the context of the shame of Adam and Eve looking at the genitals, but I talked about embarrassment in relation, because I thought of it as embarrassment rather than shame, in the sense I thought of it as the humiliation of someone seeing you or your mother hearing about it, and not simply internally. But I didn't want to fold the story entirely into the family, because I don't think ultimately, because I was trying to have it both ways. Because I think that the whole point of the way in which narrative, literature, and ultimately a story like the story of Adam and Eve works. I said at the very beginning that that particular story has a long life and keeps changing. I didn't say this, but because certain people put their entire bodies and souls into the story and figure out how to do that. And what I was trying to describe was how it happened in the 4th century with this peculiar person. I could tell you the same story about Albrecht Dürer, who also who gave Adam and Eve bodies that they hadn't had before. I could tell you the story by way of John Milton. And I would tell you with a different set of things, not with shame and embarrassment, but in the case of Dürer, with a narcissistic investment in his own body. Or in the case of Milton, with a a horrible realization that he was lonelier once he was married than he was before he was married. As a kind of punctum, as a kind of anecdotal punctum. But in either of those cases, too, would I want to turn Adam and Eve's body into Durer's narcissism? No, finally not. Or would I want to turn the relationship that Milton manages to give Adam and Eve, they squabble, they do this, they that, into Milton's miserable marriage to Mary Powell? No, but they have to be there. They have to be present, because the artists are actually, or the philosopher, the artist, the people who make these changes, and they're, of course, in the case of, my real interest is how Adam and Eve how they keep going and how they become real. And they become real by, like Aztec sacrifice, by people giving their bodies and souls to the cult. And what I was trying to describe to you today was how Augustine, in this case, gave his body and soul to the transformation of Adam and Eve. And if I did too much with shame and revenge, I would do the opposite of have Adam and Eve collapsing actually into Augustine. So that was my reserve, as it were.